This story begins with a coffee date. Just two friends catching up like so many of us do. The location? A popular cafe in the heart of Jakarta, Indonesia. A place full of life, laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee. It was a day that should have been ordinary. But it wasn't. One friend left that cafe with her life unchanged. The other left in an ambulance, her lips blue, her body shutting down, and within an hour she was dead. All from a single sip of coffee. What could turn an everyday coffee date into a scene of death and confusion? How could a simple social gathering end with someone being poisoned? As you hear this, the questions probably already start swirling in your mind. How did this happen? Who could do something so chilling, and why? What went so terribly wrong that day? This is a case that grips you from the very beginning because it makes you ask yourself, can you ever really trust the person sitting across from you at the table? The story we're about to tell is unlike any other. It's not just about a sudden tragic death, but about two women whose lives, once intertwined by friendship, became the center of one of Indonesia's most shocking murder cases. The date was January 6, 2016, a sunny afternoon in Jakarta. The kind of day when people fill shopping malls, grab lunch with friends, and enjoy a quiet break from their busy lives. That's exactly what this pair of friends was doing, taking a break, reconnecting. But something was different about this meeting. Even before one of them had a chance to sit down and drink her coffee, events were already in motion that no one could have predicted. The shock came fast. One moment, it was laughter and casual conversation. The next, chaos. A woman collapsed, struggling for air. Her friends and cafe staff stood frozen, not knowing what to do, as the color drained from her face. An ambulance was called, but by the time it arrived, it was already too late. Imagine the confusion, the terror of being at that cafe, witnessing something so sudden, so inexplicable, a healthy young woman dead, without warning. A day that started so normally had turned into a scene of horror. No one at that cafe knew it then, but this event would become the beginning of a long, dark journey that would captivate an entire nation. As the police began to investigate, what seemed at first to be a tragic medical emergency turned into something far more sinister. The coffee that one friend had prepared for the other? Laced with cyanide, a poison designed to kill quickly, silently, and without mercy. And so the story of a friendship began to unravel. The press would label this the coffee murder case, but behind that simple phrase lies a mystery that is far more complex, raising questions about trust, motive, and betrayal. Was it an accident, a mistake, or was it premeditated murder? If it was intentional, why would one friend do something so horrifying to the other? What was going on beneath the surface of this friendship that could lead to such a devastating conclusion? The answers, as you'll soon discover, are not straightforward, and they might leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and friendship. But let's not rush ahead. You've heard the headlines before. Maybe you've even seen the photos, a smiling group of friends at a cafe, a cup of iced coffee that would soon become infamous. But what you haven't heard are the details, the chilling twists and turns that make this story so haunting, so unforgettable. Because it's not just about what happened that afternoon, it's about the relationship between these two women. One that began with laughter, secrets, and shared experiences, but ended with suspicion, accusations, and eventually a trial that captivated the entire country. What could drive a person to commit such a crime, if indeed it was a crime? What signs were missed along the way? Could this have been prevented? And most importantly, how did it all come to this? So stay with me as we explore the shocking details of the coffee date that ended in murder. By the end of this story, you'll have a better understanding of how a seemingly innocent friendship could spiral into one of Indonesia's most notorious murder cases. This isn't just a story about a crime, it's a story about human relationships, trust, and the thin line that can sometimes separate friendship from betrayal. This is the truth behind the coffee murder. To truly understand how this tragic event unfolded, we must first rewind and take a closer look at the friendship between Jessica Wongso and Wayan Mirna Salihin. On the surface, their story began like so many others. two young women crossing paths at a pivotal moment in their lives, drawn together by shared experiences and the excitement of living abroad. But, as you'll soon discover, beneath the surface of their friendship lay hidden tensions and unspoken feelings that would eventually set the stage for the unimaginable. Jessica and Myrna first met while studying at the prestigious Billy Blue College of Design in Sydney, Australia. Both of them were far from home, experiencing the challenges of life in a foreign country. As young women in their 20s, they had similar dreams, building successful careers, making a name for themselves, and navigating the new freedom of living independently. Sydney was a vibrant, bustling city full of opportunities, and for a time, it was where their friendship truly blossomed. They spent countless hours together, like so many close friends do in their college years, exploring the city, attending classes, and leaning on each other as they navigated the ups and downs of student life. For two young women from Indonesia, Sydney was exciting but also unfamiliar, and their friendship became a kind of anchor, helping them adjust to the challenges of being so far from their families. In a way, they were each other's support system during those crucial years. But not everything was as perfect as it seemed. Even back then, there were hints of tension beneath the surface, small cracks that might not have seemed significant at the time, but that would later take on a much darker meaning. Friends who knew them both would later describe subtle shifts in their dynamic. There were whispers that Jessica, despite being bright and talented, had struggled more than Myrna in certain areas of her life. While Myrna's life appeared to be on an upward trajectory, Jessica was facing her own personal battles. Myrna had met Arif Somarko, the man she would eventually marry, and was in the midst of planning her future, a future that seemed full of promise and love. She was happy, excited for the life that lay ahead of her. For Jessica, things were more complicated. She had gone through a rough breakup, and according to some reports, she was battling mental health issues. Her struggles with depression and anxiety seemed to weigh heavily on her, and she had a hard time coping with the setbacks she encountered. For a while, these challenges may have seemed like bumps in the road, issues that any young adult could face. But there was something else, something harder to define, that appeared to drive a wedge between the two friends. As often happens when life takes friends in different directions, Jessica and Myrna began to drift apart. Myrna's life was moving forward, full of love, new beginnings, and optimism. Meanwhile, Jessica was grappling with her own difficulties, and it seemed that the distance between them was growing, both emotionally and physically. By the time they both returned home to Indonesia after their studies, their once close friendship had changed. There were fewer phone calls, less time spent together. Jessica, still struggling with the weight of her personal setbacks, seemed to be slipping away from the vibrant, hopeful young woman she had once been. Myrna, on the other hand, was flourishing. Her engagement to Arif marked a new chapter in her life, one that appeared full of happiness and security. But despite the distance that had grown between them, there was still something that kept them connected. A lingering bond from their college days. And so, on January the 6th, 2016, they made plans to meet up once again. This time in Jakarta, Indonesia, a far cry from the days they spent together in Sydney. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon, an ordinary coffee date, perhaps an opportunity to rekindle the friendship they once had, to catch up on life, to laugh and reminisce about the old days. And yet, something felt different about this meeting. Maybe it was the passage of time, or perhaps it was the unspoken tension that had built up between them, but there was an undeniable sense that their friendship wasn't what it used to be. Jessica, who had once been Myrna's confidant and close companion, was now a more distant figure, still present, but changed. Whatever it was that had once bonded them seemed to have frayed at the edges. As they sat down together that afternoon at the trendy Olivier Cafe in the Grand Indonesia shopping mall, one could only imagine what was going through their minds. Was this meeting an attempt to bridge the gap that had formed between them? Or was it simply a perfunctory get-together? Two former friends going through the motions. Jessica arrived first, choosing a table and placing the orders in advance. It seemed like a thoughtful gesture on the surface, but what came next would change everything. When Myrna finally arrived with their mutual friend Hani, she had no idea that this simple act, drinking the coffee that Jessica had ordered for her, would be the last thing she would ever do. The afternoon that started with small talk and smiles would soon descend into chaos. In a matter of minutes, their long and complicated friendship would come to a devastating and irreversible end. But how did it come to this? What led to this final meeting between two friends who had once been inseparable? And more importantly, was this just an unfortunate accident, or was there something far more deliberate at play? It was January 6, 2016, and Jakarta's Grand Indonesia shopping mall was teeming with life. The Olivier Cafe was no different, full of chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the warm, rich aroma of coffee. It was the kind of place people went to relax, to escape the bustle of the city, to catch up with friends. Jessica Wongo was the first to arrive. She entered the cafe alone, choosing a table in the middle of the busy room. She appeared calm and composed, nothing out of the ordinary. She didn't seem rushed or anxious, just a young woman settling in to meet with an old friend. But there was one thing about Jessica's actions that would later stand out. She ordered the drinks in advance. Among the orders was the now infamous Vietnamese iced coffee. This would be the drink that would lead to one of Indonesia's most shocking and talked about criminal cases. But at that moment, it was just an ordinary cup of coffee, waiting for its intended recipient. Jessica didn't just order Mirna's drink. She also ordered her own, and one for their mutual friend, Hani, who would be joining them. For the cafe staff, this seemed like a thoughtful gesture, preparing in advance so that when her friends arrived, they could get right to catching up. But, in hindsight, that seemingly innocent decision to order early would take on a far more sinister meaning. Mirna and Hani arrived a little after 5 p.m. that day. Mirna greeted Jessica warmly, smiling as they reunited after months of not seeing each other. It had been a while since they last met, but there was no indication that anything was wrong between them. From the outside, it looked like a typical meeting of friends, reconnecting over drinks in a cozy. They sat down, and as the drinks were brought to the table, there was still no sign of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Mirna, always the cheerful one, was in good spirits. She had no reason to suspect that this afternoon would be any different from any other, but as she reached for her drink, the Vietnamese iced coffee that Jessica had so thoughtfully ordered for her, fate would take a cruel turn. Mirna took her first sip, expecting nothing more than the refreshing taste of coffee. But within moments, something was terribly wrong. She grimaced, her face tightening in discomfort. At first, her friends might have thought she had simply swallowed the drink wrong, maybe that it was a bit too strong for her taste. But it was much worse than that. Almost immediately, Mirna began to feel ill. Her body seemed to betray her as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Her breathing grew labored, gasping for air as though her lungs were fighting against her. The color drained from her face, and her eyes widened in panic. What was happening? This wasn't just a bad reaction to coffee. It was something far more serious. Jessica and Hani were caught off guard, confused by what they were seeing. In those first few moments, no one could understand what was happening. Maybe they thought it was food poisoning, maybe some sort of allergic reaction. But within minutes, things escalated far beyond anything they could have imagined. Mirna collapsed onto the floor, her body convulsing. People around them began to notice the commotion, and panic quickly set in. The once lively cafe fell silent as customers and staff rushed to help, trying to understand what had caused this sudden and violent reaction. Was she choking? Was there something wrong with the food or drink? No one knew. The cafe staff quickly called for an ambulance, but time was running out. As Mirna lay on the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably, the gravity of the situation became clear. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Jessica and Hani, still reeling from the shock, watched as their friend's condition worsened. What had started as a simple afternoon coffee had spiraled into a nightmare. Within an hour of arriving at the cafe, Mirna was being rushed to Abdi Walia Hospital, her life hanging by a thread. By the time she arrived at the hospital, it was already too late. Doctors worked frantically to save her, but there was nothing they could do. At 6:30 p.m., just over an hour after she took that fateful sip of coffee, Wayan Mirna Salihin was pronounced dead. Her sudden death left everyone in shock. How could a healthy, vibrant young woman collapse and die so suddenly? The doctors struggled to find an immediate explanation. It wasn't until later that the truth would come to light. Myrna's coffee had been laced with cyanide, a deadly poison. As word of Myrna's death spread, the cafe became the center of a media frenzy. The public was desperate for answers. What had caused this tragedy? Was it an accident? Could it have been a mistake with the ingredients? Or was it something more deliberate? The cafe, the coffee, the staff, everything was questioned. And then, attention began to turn to the person who had ordered the drink in the first place. Jessica Wongo. Jessica's calm demeanor in the aftermath of Myrna's death raised suspicions. Why hadn't she reacted more strongly when her friend collapsed? Why did she remain composed while everyone else around her panicked? These were the questions that would soon come to dominate the investigation. In the days that followed, the police began to piece together the events of that afternoon. They reviewed the cafe's CCTV footage, interviewed witnesses, and examined the toxicology reports. The more they dug, the more they began to suspect that Myrna's death had not been an accident at all. The Vietnamese iced coffee, which Jessica had ordered in advance, became the key piece of evidence. Traces of cyanide were found in the drink, enough to kill someone within minutes. And Jessica, the friend who had once been so close to Myrna, was now at the center of the investigation. But was Jessica really capable of such a heinous act? What would drive someone to poison their friend? And how did their once strong friendship lead to this fatal encounter? As the investigation deepened, the public became captivated by the case. It wasn't just about the crime. It was about the unraveling of a friendship, the motives that lay beneath the surface, and the shocking realization that not everything was as it seemed. What had seemed like a tragic accident was now being treated as a potential murder, and the prime suspect? Jessica Wongo. But was she truly guilty? Or was there more to the story than met the eye? The investigation immediately turned its focus to those closest to Myrna at the time of her death. Among them was Jessica, the friend who had invited her for coffee, arrived early to the cafe, and ordered the drinks before anyone else showed up. Was Jessica merely a witness to this horrific event, or was there something more sinister behind her action? The detectives delved into Jessica's behavior leading up to and following Myrna's death, and what they found raised more questions than answers. Why had Jessica arrived at the cafe so much earlier than her friends? Why had she insisted on ordering the drinks in advance? Was this the behavior of someone simply eager to catch up with old friends? Or was there another motive lurking beneath the surface? Witnesses at the cafe recalled something else that unsettled investigators. While Myrna convulsed, gasping for air, Jessica had remained unnervingly calm. Those who were there that day spoke of how Jessica's expression barely changed as her friend's life slipped away in front of her. She didn't rush to help, she didn't panic, and she didn't seem to show the kind of fear or distress one might expect from someone witnessing such a traumatic event. Instead, she watched, as if detached from the horror unfolding around her. The investigators couldn't ignore this detail. Was Jessica's composure simply a result of shock, a defense mechanism that left her frozen in the moment? Or was it evidence of something far darker, a lack of remorse, a calculated response from someone who had known exactly what was happening? As they dug deeper, Jessica's actions before the cafe meeting raised further suspicions. They uncovered reports that suggested her life had taken a downward turn in the months leading up to the incident. Struggling with personal issues, battling mental health challenges, and having gone through a painful breakup, Jessica's life seemed to be spiraling out of control. And then there was the strain in her friendship with Myrna. By all accounts, Myrna's life appeared to be on an upward trajectory. She had recently married the love of her life, rder, and was brimming with happiness. In contrast, Jessica seemed to be facing one setback after another, struggling to find her place in the world. This contrast between their lives raised the inevitable question: could jealousy have been a motive? Had the mounting tension between the two friends boiled over, resulting in an act of cold-blooded murder? For the investigators continued to piece together the puzzle, reviewing CCTV footage from the cafe, interviewing the staff, and speaking to anyone who had witnessed the event. Every detail, no matter how small, was scrutinized. They needed to understand how and why this happened, and whether Jessica was truly the person responsible for the deadly act. But as the investigation progressed, something strange happened. Jessica's demeanor remained consistent. She didn't crack under the pressure, she didn't break down, and she didn't seem to show any signs of guilt. In fact, when questioned by the police, Jessica remained calm and composed, denying any involvement in Myrna's death. She insisted that she had no idea how the cyanide ended up in the coffee, and that she was just as shocked as everyone else by what had happened. Her behavior continued to baffle investigators. Was she truly innocent, or was this a well-rehearsed performance by someone who had planned every detail of the crime? The more they pressed, the more elusive the answers became. But as more witnesses came forward and the toxicology reports confirmed the presence of cyanide, the weight of evidence seemed to point in one direction. All eyes were on Jessica. Yet, even with growing suspicion surrounding her, there was still no direct proof tying her to the crime. The investigation had uncovered many unsettling details, but it lacked the one crucial piece of evidence that could definitively prove Jessica's guilt. As the case continued to unfold, the public became increasingly divided. Some were convinced that Jessica was responsible for Myrna's death, while others believed she was being unfairly targeted. The media latched onto every twist and turn, fueling the frenzy surrounding the case. The tension surrounding the investigation was palpable. Was this a case of cold-blooded murder, or had an innocent woman been caught in the crossfire of a tragic accident? As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the pressure on the investigators grew. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. But with no clear motive, no eyewitness to the actual poisoning, and no physical evidence linking Jessica to the crime, the case remained a complex and puzzling mystery. The investigators were left with a series of circumstantial clues and a growing list of questions. What had truly happened that afternoon at Olivier Café? And, as the case reached its boiling point, one question loomed larger than all the others. Was Jessica Wongo a cold and calculating killer? Or had someone else pulled the strings in this deadly game of deception? The investigation was far from over, and with every passing day, new revelations would come to light, drawing the public further into the tangled web of this chilling murder case. And yet, the story was only just beginning. The first major clue came from the surveillance footage inside Olivier Café. The cameras captured every detail of that afternoon. Jessica's arrival, the moment she ordered the drinks, and the minutes she spent alone with them before Myrna and Hanny arrived. Investigators scrutinized this footage. They watched as Jessica selected a table, then ordered the drinks, including the Vietnamese iced coffee that would later become infamous. One detail immediately stood out. Jessica had been alone with the drinks for several minutes. She hadn't just ordered them, she had spent time with them, positioning them, and even glancing around as if ensuring everything was in place. Could this have been the moment when something lethal was slipped into Myrna's coffee? No one had seen her add anything, but those few minutes were crucial. They raised questions that would haunt investigators as they tried to piece together what really happened. But this wasn't all that made the detectives suspicious. As they delved into Jessica's personal life, a darker picture began to emerge. It wasn't just about what had happened on the day of the murder. It was about everything that led up to it. Jessica's recent behavior had been erratic, to say the least. She had been struggling with deep personal issues, including a history of depression and signs of emotional instability following a devastating breakup. People who knew her described someone who was once ambitious, energetic, and full of life. But something had changed. She had become withdrawn, plagued by mental health struggles that seemed to consume her. At the same time, Myrna's life appeared to be everything Jessica's wasn't. Myrna had recently married, was deeply in love, and was looking forward to a bright future with her husband, Eriath. It wasn't hard to imagine that seeing Myrna's happiness might have triggered feelings of envy or resentment in Jessica, especially given the rough patch she was going through. Could jealousy have been the driving force behind this heinous act? Some close to Jessica would later recall moments where she seemed to fixate on Myrna's life. They would talk about how Jessica had struggled with comparisons, how Myrna's perfect life had been a silent source of bitterness for her. Others, however, would paint a different picture. A friendship that had its ups and downs, but nothing that could explain such an extreme act of violence. Was this simply a case of two friends who had drifted apart? Or had the lines between envy and hatred blurred beyond repair? As the police pieced together these personal details, more red flags began to appear. There were reports that, following her failed relationship, Jessica's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. She had confided in friends about her emotional distress, about how she felt like her life was falling apart. Her mental health struggles were well documented. But the investigators had to consider, did this emotional turmoil make her capable of murder? Or was this just a red herring, a way to explain away her suspicious behavior without any hard evidence? Even with these troubling personal details, the case was far from clear-cut. There were no eyewitnesses who had actually seen Jessica tamper with the drink. No one could say with certainty that they saw her add cyanide to the coffee. The surveillance footage showed her with the drinks, but it didn't show her committing the act. It was circumstantial, yes, but it wasn't definitive. And then there was the cyanide itself. Despite thorough searches, no trace of the poison was found on Jessica or among her belongings. There was no vial, no residue, nothing to physically link her to the deadly substance. How had the cyanide made its way into the coffee, and why hadn't any evidence of it been found on Jessica? These were questions that the investigators wrestled with as they built their case. Despite these gaps in the evidence, suspicion continued to hover over Jessica. Her behavior, both at the cafe and in the days following Myrna's death, only deepened the mystery. While most people would be devastated by the sudden loss of a close friend, Jessica's reaction seemed cold, almost detached. Witnesses recalled how, even as Myrna was gasping for air, Jessica remained composed. Her demeanor didn't fit the typical emotional response one might expect in such a traumatic situation. In interviews with the police, Jessica was calm and consistent. She maintained her innocence from the very beginning, claiming that she had no reason to harm Myrna. She insisted that she was as shocked and horrified as everyone else by what had happened. Yet, her lack of outward emotion struck investigators as strange. Was this the behavior of someone who was genuinely innocent? Or was it the mask of someone hiding a dark secret? As days turned into weeks, the evidence began to stack up against Jessica, though it remained circumstantial. The police and prosecutors had to decide, was this enough to charge her with murder? Without direct evidence of the crime, could they convince a jury that Jessica had been the one to poison Myrna? It was a high-stakes gamble, and they knew that the outcome of this case would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Jessica, but for Myrna's grieving family. Despite the uncertainty, the mounting circumstantial evidence, combined with Jessica's odd behavior and personal struggles, was enough to move forward. Jessica Wongo was officially charged with the murder of Yan Myrna Salin, and the trial that followed would captivate not only Indonesia, but the entire world. But even as the prosecution prepared its case, one question remained. Could they prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jessica was the mastermind behind this cold-blooded act? Or was there still a possibility that someone else, unseen and unsuspected, had played a role in Myrna's death? As the trial of Jessica Wongo began, all eyes were on the courtroom in Jakarta. This wasn't just about proving a murder. It was about untangling the web of secrets, motives, and relationships that led to the death of Yan Myrna Salin. The public was gripped by the case, glued to their televisions and phones as the drama unfolded, step by step, in front of the world. The courtroom was packed. Spectators, journalists, and family members of both Myrna and Jessica filled the seats each day, eager to hear every word, every detail. This trial was more than just a legal battle. It had become a media circus, with intense public interest hanging on each new revelation. The cameras caught every expression, every subtle glance, making the trial feel more like a real-life crime drama than a straightforward court proceeding. The prosecution opened its case by painting Jessica as a woman deeply affected by jealousy and bitterness. They framed the narrative around her struggles, the failed relationship, her mental health challenges, and the contrasting success and happiness of Myrna, who had found love and was building a life with her husband, Arif. The motive, they argued, was clear. Jessica had harbored a quiet resentment toward Myrna for years, a resentment that had culminated in that deadly coffee meeting. The prosecutors presented what they believed was compelling evidence. They detailed the timeline of events on the day of the murder, showing how Jessica had arrived early at the cafe, ordered the drinks, and been left alone with them for several minutes. They highlighted how Jessica had been the one to place the iced coffee in front of Myrna, and how just minutes after Myrna took a sip, she collapsed in agony. But it wasn't just the timeline they focused on. They also brought in experts to testify about the cyanide. Toxicologists took the stand, explaining how the traces of cyanide in Myrna's coffee were enough to kill within minutes. They described the effects of cyanide poisoning in vivid detail: the burning sensation, the difficulty breathing, the convulsions, all symptoms that matched what Myrna experienced. The prosecution used this scientific evidence to drive home the point that this was no accident. Myrna had been poisoned, and Jessica, in their view, was the only person who could have done it. But despite the prosecution's efforts, the defense was ready to fight back. Jessica's lawyers argued that the case against their client was built on nothing more than speculation. Yes, Jessica had been at the cafe, and yes, she had ordered the drinks, but none of this was definitive proof that she had poisoned Myrna. There were no eyewitnesses who could testify that they had seen Jessica tamper with the coffee. The surveillance footage, which had been so central to the investigation, didn't show Jessica adding anything to the drink. In fact, there was no hard evidence that she had ever been in possession of cyanide. The defense team seized on this lack of direct evidence. How could the prosecution claim, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jessica had committed the crime when they couldn't produce the poison or show exactly how it had been introduced into the drink? It was a crucial point, one that left the jurors with lingering doubts about the strength of the prosecution's case. Jessica herself remained a central figure throughout the trial. Sitting in the courtroom, she was calm, composed, and almost expressionless, even as the prosecution tried to portray her as a jealous, resentful woman capable of cold-blooded murder. Her demeanor became a subject of intense scrutiny. Was she simply in shock, unable to process what was happening? Or was this the face of someone hiding something much darker? The public debated this endlessly, and it became a key element of the trial's narrative. But the prosecution had more cards to play. They introduced testimony from witnesses who had known Jessica in the months leading up to the murder. Friends and acquaintances spoke of her emotional state, how she had struggled after her breakup, how she seemed to fixate on Myrna's happiness, and how her behavior had become increasingly erratic. One witness even recalled a conversation where Jessica had allegedly expressed bitterness toward people who were in happy relationships, suggesting that this was a point of deep pain for her. The trial also revealed strange moments in Jessica's past, incidents that hinted at a history of troubling behavior. These details, while not directly connected to Myrna's murder, added to the overall image the prosecution was trying to paint. That of a woman who had been pushed to the edge, someone who could no longer control her emotions or actions. Despite these testimonies, the defense continued to argue that there was no physical evidence linking Jessica to the cyanide. Without the poison itself, they argued, the entire case rested on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. They emphasized that Jessica had never confessed to the crime, had never wavered in her claim of innocence, and had cooperated fully with the investigation from the start. As the trial progressed, public opinion began to split. Some were convinced of Jessica's guilt, swayed by the prosecution's narrative of jealousy and resentment. Others believed that the evidence was too weak, that the case was more about emotion and suspicion than hard facts. The media coverage only fueled this divide, with headlines focusing on every twist and turn, every dramatic moment in the courtroom. Then came the closing arguments. The prosecution made a final plea to the jury, urging them to see the pattern of behavior, the timeline, the poison, and the circumstances as one cohesive narrative of murder. They framed Jessica as a woman driven by jealousy and resentment, who had carefully planned to poison her friend in a moment of premeditated revenge. They argued that the lack of direct evidence didn't erase the overwhelming circumstantial case they had built. The defense, in turn, reminded the jury of the burden of proof. They reiterated that the case against Jessica was filled with holes. No eyewitnesses, no cyanide found on her, no clear proof that she had tampered with the coffee. They asked the jury to consider whether they could truly convict someone of murder when so many questions remained unanswered. After weeks of testimony and intense public scrutiny, the jury was finally given the case. The courtroom was tense as they deliberated. Would they convict Jessica based on the circumstantial evidence, or would the lack of hard proof lead them to acquit her? Hours passed, and the world waited for the verdict. On October 27, 2016, the jury delivered their decision. Jessica Wongo was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The courtroom erupted, some in shock, others in satisfaction. Outside, crowds gathered to hear the news, and the media broadcasted the verdict across the nation. But even as the verdict was handed down, questions lingered. Was justice truly served? Was there enough evidence to convict beyond a reasonable doubt? Or was the case built more on public opinion than solid proof? And, most hauntingly, had all the answers really been uncovered? Or was there more to this story than anyone could know? The case of Jessica Wongo and Wayan Mirna Salihin may have officially ended with a guilty verdict, but for many, the mystery still lingers. Even now, years later, it remains one of the most debated and talked about cases in Indonesia's history. As the years passed after Jessica Wongo's conviction, the story of Wayan Mirna Salihin's tragic death continued to echo in the public consciousness. The courtroom drama may have ended, but the questions and debates surrounding the case never fully faded. Jessica's sentence, 20 years for premeditated murder, was a heavy burden to carry. But it also came with the chance of parole. After serving around 8 years in prison, Jessica was released on August 18, 2024, free once again, but forever shadowed by the events of that fateful day in January 2016. Her release sparked a new wave of media attention. For some, it reignited old wounds. Mirna's family, still grieving the loss of their daughter, found no peace in Jessica's early release. Her father, Edi Darmawan Salihin, who had tirelessly fought for justice, voiced his pain and frustration. For him, no amount of time served would ever bring back the vibrant, loving daughter he had lost. In the years since the trial, the case had gained international notoriety, thanks in part to the documentary Ice Cold: Murder, Coffee and Jessica Wong, which aired on Netflix in September 2023. The film took viewers deep into the heart of the case, unraveling the layers of intrigue, suspicion and tragedy. Through interviews with key players, including Jessica herself, Mirna's family and the legal experts involved, viewers were invited to re-examine the facts. Was Jessica truly guilty? Could there have been another explanation for what happened that day at Olivier Cafe? For some, the documentary only deepened the mystery. Jessica maintained her innocence throughout the film, giving interviews where she appeared composed, articulate and firm in her belief that she had been wrongfully convicted. She spoke about the impact the trial had on her life, the emotional toll of being labeled a murderer, and the years she spent behind bars. To her supporters, Jessica was a victim of circumstantial evidence, of a legal system that had failed her. To them, the real truth had never been uncovered, and Jessica had paid the price for a crime she did not commit. But for others, the documentary was a painful reminder of the tragedy that had befallen Mirna and her family. It was hard to forget the images of Mirna collapsing in the cafe, her life slipping away after just one sip of that coffee. It was difficult to ignore the mounting evidence that had pointed to Jessica, her unusual behavior before and after the incident, the tension between her and Mirna, the unexplained moments when she had been alone with the drinks. And then, of course, there was the cyanide, an odorless, deadly chemical that had been detected in the coffee, leaving no doubt that Mirna had been poisoned. The public remained divided. To this day, the case of Wayan Mirna Salihin's murder continues to stir debates. On one side, there are those who believe that justice was served, that Jessica Wongo had both the motive and the opportunity to carry out the crime. On the other, there are those who argue that the evidence was not enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, that the possibility of another explanation should not be dismissed so easily. In the end, though, what is undeniable is the devastating loss of a life. Mirna was only 27 years old when she died, newly married and filled with dreams for her future. Her life was cut short in a moment that no one could have predicted, and her family continues to carry the weight of that loss every day. For them, the trial and conviction brought some measure of closure, but it could never fill the void that Mirna's death had left behind. Jessica's release has once again brought the story back into the headlines, but with it comes a reminder of the fragility of life and the complexity of human relationships. What started as a casual meeting between friends in a bustling cafe ended in tragedy, with one woman dead and another imprisoned. It's a case that has left an indelible mark on everyone involved, and one that will not soon be forgotten. As we reflect on the events that unfolded, one question still lingers. What truly happened that day? Was this an act of jealousy, a cold-blooded murder orchestrated by someone who had lost control? Or was it a terrible accident, a case of misjudgment and circumstantial evidence that led to a wrongful conviction? Perhaps we'll never have all the answers. But what we do know is that Mirna's story, her life, and her death will forever serve as a reminder of how quickly things can change and how little we sometimes know about the people we think we're closest to. So, as we close this chapter, we leave you with the same question that has haunted so many. Was Jessica Wongo truly guilty, or was there something more to this story than anyone could ever prove? If you believe that justice was served and that those who commit murder should be held accountable, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think otherwise would avoid joining our growing community. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and vigilant, because sometimes the truth is closer than you think.